What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so one of our subscribers wanted me to give a take on what's the difference between the stars of the 80s and 90s and the stars of today. So let me say this, because sometimes we get accused of being like nostalgia addicts who are not living in this century, that we think it's 1991 or 1998 in our heads, and we won't live in we won't live in the present, we're living in the past and all this other nonsense. I do believe that today's players are all better ball handlers in general than players of the past. I think that can't be really argued. Players of today, they're better ball handlers. They have better on-ball skills, yes. They're better three-point shooters today. The ubiquitous of the three-point shot pretty much necessitates that they're better three-point shooters than they were just 10, 15 years ago, let alone the 80s and 90s, obviously. Outside of mid-range shooting, players of today are better, to the point where a lot of these guys have range beyond mid-court. We saw that just yesterday with the guy Hauser from the Boston Celtics hitting a half-court three. We saw that early in the playoffs with Jamal Murray. I think we saw it maybe one other time in the playoffs. In the past, we saw that happen once every 2 or 3 years. Someone hitting a half-court shot. Players are better free throw shooters today. So there's that, okay? But to me, I prefer the players of the 80s and 90s. And I think the reason why a lot of us have such nostalgia for the players of the 80s and 90s, because for one, there was a lot more offensive versatility back then. Everybody wasn't doing the same thing. Everybody wasn't doing the step back threes, and everybody wasn't always trying to get these cheapies as far as points and fouls, and everything wasn't so pushed out to the perimeter. Everybody wasn't so fixated on perimeter play and 3-point shooting, and what's considered skilled is if you're a big man that can shoot from outside. Whereas, for instance, me, I've always been drawn toward defense. I've always been drawn toward centers. So it is painful sometimes for me to watch basketball and see what it has devolved to, in my opinion, which is analytics have ruined the game. Just like you could argue analytics ruined football. And analytics, when I say football, I mean the NFL. And analytics ruined the NFL. And Major League Baseball. We don't see what happened to the Tony Gwynn's, the Kirby Puckett's, what happened to those guys? What happened to the high average guys? What happened to those guys? What happened to the 3,000 hit players, the guys who got singles, and the Pete Roses? And what happened to the Ricky Hendersons? We don't see those guys anymore. Everybody wants to swing for the fences. Now you got guys getting paid millions of dollars who are legitimately going out there without criticism, hitting 40 home runs, maybe driving in 110 runs, but they're batting 220 and striking out 200 times, and that's acceptable now. Reggie Jackson would have been pilloried by the press for doing that. But anyway, I digress. Go back to basketball. The players of the past to me were also tougher. I'm sorry. They were tougher. They weren't such whining prima donnas like today. You saw that. Don't get me wrong. You had guys who were crybabies and all that. But generally, the players were tougher. Why? Because the rules weren't as stringent when it came to what defenders could do out there. The offensive stars and offensive players weren't as protected. They didn't have as much freedom. They couldn't do everything with the basketball they were to do now, you know? So by nature, that made the players tougher. That made them less crybabyish. Also, players, generally went to 3 to 4 years of college back then. So they were used to being a team-oriented game. So while they did have individual skill sets, they could still play within the confines of a team. You had your exceptions. You had your guys who were considered selfish players, and they usually didn't last too long in that NBA. Today, they may flourish because the team game is not really pushed much. When you think about it, Denver has had a lot of success, mainly because they generally play a more team-oriented ball game. And Mike Malone's a really good coach. Takes after his father, Brendan. In the 80s especially, I'll say too, that the NBA was just more talented. Now, I know a lot of people say, oh, well, today there's 30 teams. And in the 80s, there were 23 teams. Until the late 80s was expanded to 27, I think. But remember this. You can make a strong argument that in the 80s, we had just enough teams so that there was enough competition. Not like in the 60s where, sometimes Bill Russell only had 7 other teams to contend with. There were 23 teams after 1980 with the addition of the Dallas Mavericks. But with lesser teams compared to today, you could say the talent wasn't as spread thin. You know what I mean? You could argue that today's NBA, the talent is spread out so much that there are guys playing in the NBA today who wouldn't have made the NBA back in the 80s. Whereas, with there being fewer teams, look, just do this. Let's just say, I tell you exactly what I mean. Let's say you're playing a video game. I know this, oh man, you're playing a video game, but let's just hear me out. Let's just say you're playing a 2K, right? And you're using a custom roster. And you got nothing but legends on there, right? Nothing but legends on your roster. As far as, in your draft pool. Now, if you spread all these legends out across the now 30 teams, that's going to be a very talented league, right? Let's say you had 100 legends in the draft pool. That's going to be a very talented NBA. But if you were to contract 7 teams away, right? If you took 7 teams away and it went down to 23, well, that means those other legends are going to replace, ultimately, some of the less talented teams, less talented players on the other teams. Which means that the league is going to be more talented because, those guys are going to get signed somewhere, right? You're not going to have Jerry West sitting somewhere and be playing Paul McKeskey, right? So ultimately, I should have used another guard, but you know my point. You could argue the 80s was just deeper. And you could just look at it as far as how many stars were on these teams. Like, people like to say the Detroit Pistons didn't have but so many Hall of Famers, but look. You had Buda Edwards at center. You had, depending upon what year it was, you had John Spider Sally in the front court, who was a good player. You had Bill Laimbeer, who was just below the old notch for Hall of Fame. But as the Hall of Fame began to lower its standards, and, when you have a guy like Draymond Green getting in, you kind of looking at Bill Laimbeer, well, maybe he is a Hall of Famer by today's standards. Dennis Rodman's already a Hall of Famer. Isaiah Thomas is a Hall of Famer. Joe Dumars is close to that. You know what I'm saying? Then, of course, before they won the championship, they had Adrian Dantley on those teams. That's a lot of star power, right? You know what I'm saying? Then, of course, you had the Lakers, who at any given time had Magic, Kareem, Worthy, Bob McAdoo, Jamal Wilkes, Norm Nixon. Later on, of course, they had Byron Scott, Michael Thompson. Those teams that was normal. Today we'll say those are super teams, but back then that was normal. The players back then had, they also were more available. You didn't see nearly as many players not playing 70 games at least. These guys played through injuries. If they were hurt, not injured per se, to the point where if they played, it would hurt them more. They may have had discomfort, but they played through it. They would get injections to numb the pain and play through it. Look, Jared Allen would have been forced by his teammates of the Cavaliers. They would have forced his ass to play. I'm telling you, that shit where these guys were just sitting down because they didn't feel like 100%. That's that crap. Remember a couple years ago, Zion said, well, I'm not going to play because I don't feel 100%. Man, let me tell you something. In the 80s, his teammates would have whooped his ass. Ain't no way in hell you're the highest paid player on this team, and I got to take my ass out there and play, and I'm hurt, and you're not playing because you don't want to be, you're not 100%. Then we know that you're laying up with some 304 somewhere. Man, you better get your ass out there and play. Man, they would have beat whatever. So, just so many different factors as to why I like the players of the past, man. And then, the way that I saw basketball growing up, man, it was like Kobe Bryant said. He said once that today's stars, the difference between today's stars is like the offense is kind of predictable. Guys drive the basket, they kick it out to a shooter, they kick it out to this guy, they kick it out to that guy. Whereas when he played, it was more purposeful and more aggressive basketball. One-on-one, the players, generally the offensive players, they were a little bit, okay, you might know that a guy's going to score, but these guys had more in their bags back then. You know what I'm saying? Like, a lot of guards, say for instance, point guards, they had the mid-range. They had a little bit of three ball back then too. Don't act like the guys in the 90s couldn't shoot threes. They just didn't rely on it to the extent that these guys do today, but they could shoot the three ball. They had the mid-range game, which has totally disappeared starting in the late 90s and it's almost extinct now. Point guards could post you up back then. Plus they played defense, plus they could facilitate. Centers back then, they actually were centers. You know what I mean? Like these guys actually were down low players. People marvel at Jokic, but that was commonplace in the 80s and 90s. Jack Sikma could do all the things that Jokic could do in the post and more. He wasn't all around skilled like Jokic in some other ways, but although he could shoot from outside like Jokic. But that was commonplace. Big men were supposed to be able to score down low. Interesting that when Jokic was going up against an actual center, or like whether it was Cat or when it was Cat and Gobert guarding him, notice his efficiency went down. Remember that game when he had like 30 points, but he took almost 30 shots? See, that's what would have happened if he played in the 80s and 90s. Matter of fact, I'll be honest with you. I'm not convinced that Jokic is better than Brad Daugherty. I'm just not. I think if you put Brad Daugherty in today's NBA and he's healthy and he's allowed to facilitate, I think Brad Daugherty could average in today's league 25, 13, and 9 too. I really do believe that. And players of the past had higher IQs. They didn't do so much stupid crap that you see today. And they were just, I don't know, man. The players of the past, it just seemed more driven, man. I think these guys today make so much money that they're not driven to play hard anymore. Look at the All-Star games. Even the commissioner just said, before one of the finals games, I think it was before Game 4, he said that we may be past the point where these guys just aren't incentivized to play hard. Allen Iverson was a millionaire. Kobe Bryant was a millionaire. Marbury was a millionaire, at least then. They played hard. So it's all of these factors, man. But anyway, tell me what you guys think.